"You can name any price," he said, sliding the black card across the table. "Because everything has one." The restaurant didn't stop, but it shifted, like the air itself was listening. Glasses paused mid-lift, a quiet ripple moving through polished marble and low golden light as Daniel Whitmore leaned back in his chair, certain, composed, a man who had never needed to repeat an offer twice. Across from him, Emily Carter stood still, her order pad resting lightly in her hand, her posture straight but unguarded. The kind of stillness that didn't come from fear but from knowing exactly where the line was. She glanced down at the card, not reaching for it, not reacting the way people usually did when confronted with something that could change their rent, their future, their entire direction. Instead, she adjusted the edge of a folded receipt near the salt shaker, a small, almost invisible motion, as if restoring balance to something only she had noticed. Daniel watched her, expecting hesitation, curiosity, maybe even calculation, because that was the pattern. That was always the pattern. Earlier that evening, she had moved through the room with quiet precision, refilling glasses before they were empty, correcting an overcharge on a bill without drawing attention, speaking only when necessary, never lingering, never performing. He had tested it then, leaving a tip that would have made most people pause, asking a question that blurred the line between professional and personal, letting his gaze stay just a second longer than polite. She had responded the same way each time, calm, respectful, distant, like she was operating in a different system altogether. Now, under the soft hum of conversation and the distant clink of silverware, his offer hung between them, heavy with assumption. Emily finally looked up, meeting his eyes directly, not challenging, not submissive, just clear. She picked up the card, turned it once between her fingers, then placed it back in front of him with the same care she used to set down a glass of water. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice even, almost gentle, "but I'm not part of what you're buying." There was no edge, no lecture, no attempt to make a point. She simply stepped back, as if the moment had already passed for her, as if it required no further explanation. And that was when it happened, something Daniel couldn't immediately name. A pause inside his own thoughts, a break in the rhythm he had relied on for years. People negotiated, they resisted, they pretended, but they always engaged, always entered the transaction in some way. She hadn't. She had declined the premise itself. Around them, the restaurant resumed its quiet motion, unaware that something had shifted in a way no one could see. Emily turned, moving toward another table, her steps measured, her focus already elsewhere, leaving nothing behind but the absence of reaction. Daniel remained seated, the black card untouched in front of him, his reflection faint in its polished surface. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about what to say next, or how to adjust the offer, or which lever to pull. He was thinking about what had just failed to move her, and why that mattered more than anything he could have bought. Daniel did not touch the card for a long time. The polished surface reflected the soft chandelier light, steady, unchanged, while something less visible shifted beneath his composure. He watched Emily move across the room, not quickly, not slowly, just with a rhythm that belonged entirely to her, placing a glass of iced water at another table before the customer even asked, adjusting a fork that had been set slightly off-center, nodding once to a colleague who seemed rushed, all of it quiet, all of it precise. She did not look back at him, not even once, and that absence of attention settled heavier than any rejection he had ever received. He had been ignored before, strategically, temporarily, but never dismissed without effort, never removed from the equation entirely. He reached for his drink, paused, then set it back down without taking a sip. Something about the moment refused to move forward in the way he expected. Across the room, a man in a tailored suit laughed too loudly, sliding his credit card across the table with the casual confidence of someone used to being noticed, and Daniel almost smiled at the familiarity of it. That was how the world worked. Predictable, responsive, measurable. You offered something, and the world answered. But Emily had not answered, not in any way he could quantify. A few minutes later, she returned to his table, not with hesitation, not with apology, just with the same composed presence she had carried all evening. She placed a fresh glass of water beside him, the condensation forming a clean ring on the white linen and straightened the edge of the billfold. Without opening it, "Your steak will be ready in about 3 minutes, she said, her tone even, professional, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Daniel looked at her, searching for a signal, a shift, something that would explain the earlier moment, but there was none. Her expression held no trace of defiance, no quiet pride, no hidden message waiting to be decoded. It was simply neutral, present, complete. "You did not even consider it," he said, his voice lower now, not sharp, not amused, just uncertain in a way that did not suit him. Emily met his gaze briefly, then reached to adjust the candle that had burned slightly uneven, the flame flickering before settling again. "I did," she replied softly, "just not in the way you expected." And with that, she stepped back, already turning toward another table before he could respond. The sentence stayed with him, not because of what it said, but because of what it did not explain. He had built his life on understanding, leverage, on reading people, on predicting outcomes 3 steps ahead, and yet this felt like standing in front of a door with no visible handle. When his meal arrived, he barely noticed the presentation, the perfectly seared surface, the careful arrangement of sides, details that usually mattered to him. Instead, his attention kept returning to the absence of something, the missing reaction, the silence that had followed her refusal. Around him, conversations continued, deals were discussed, numbers were exchanged, but for the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore found himself uninterested in the transaction in front of him. He was thinking about the one that had never happened, and why that absence felt. Always had, with logic, with argument, with a list of reasons why she was wrong, why his offer had been generous, beneficial, even rare, but the words did not come. Instead, he noticed something else, something smaller but harder to ignore, the way she had not once tried to impress him, not once adjusted her tone or posture to match his presence, not once acknowledged the imbalance everyone else seemed to feel automatically. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his card again, then stopped, his hand hovering just above the table before slowly lowering it back. Emily watched the movement without reaction, without anticipation. "Most people would have taken it," he said, more to himself than to her. She gave a slight nod, not agreeing, not disagreeing, simply recognizing the truth of the statement. "Most people are trying to change their situation," she replied softly. "I am trying to keep mine intact." And something in the way she said it shifted the meaning of everything that had happened before. Daniel looked at her then, really looked, not at the uniform, not at the role, but at the space she occupied within it. And for the first time that night, he realized he had been asking the wrong question entirely. The check remained unsigned for a few seconds longer, the pen resting beside it, untouched, as the noise of the restaurant faded into something distant, something irrelevant. When he finally picked it up, his movements were slower, more deliberate, as if each action required thought instead of habit. And as Emily stepped back once more, leaving him with the bill and his own reflection in its glossy surface, Daniel Whitmore understood that the transaction he had attempted to start had never been rejected. It had simply never existed in the way he believed it did. Daniel signed the check without looking at the total, the pen moving slower than usual, as if the act itself required more attention than the numbers ever had. Then he closed the billfold and stood, adjusting his jacket out of habit rather than necessity. The room responded the way it always did, subtle glances, a slight shift in posture from nearby tables, the quiet awareness that someone important was leaving. But tonight it felt distant, like a scene he was watching instead of directing. He reached into his pocket, placed the black card back where it belonged, and for a brief moment, his hand paused there, fingers resting against the fabric as if confirming something that had always been true but now felt incomplete. When he turned, Emily was already moving toward another table, her attention fully present with a family of 3, speaking softly to a child who was deciding between 2 desserts, her tone patient, unhurried, as if the choice mattered. Daniel watched the exchange for a second longer than he intended, noticing the way she knelt slightly to meet the child at eye level, not lowering herself, but adjusting the world so it felt even. There was no performance in it, no calculated warmth, just a consistency that did not change based on who sat in front of her. He walked toward the exit, each step measured, the polished floor reflecting fragments of light that broke and reformed beneath his shoes. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the faint hum of the city, distant traffic, the low rhythm of a place that never fully stopped. His driver stepped forward immediately, opening the door of the car, but Daniel did not get in right away. Instead, he stood there for a moment, looking back through the tall glass windows of the restaurant, his reflection overlapping with the scene inside, as if he was both part of it and separate from it at the same time. Emily moved again, now clearing a table, aligning the chairs with quiet precision, resetting the space for someone new, and the simplicity of the action held his attention in a way that did not make sense. "Sir," the driver said gently, not impatient, just reminding him of the next step that had always followed. Daniel nodded once, then slid into the back seat, the door closing with a soft, final sound. As the car pulled away, the city lights stretched into lines across the window, familiar, predictable, ordered, but his thoughts did not follow the same pattern. He reached for his phone, opened it, then stopped, the screen glowing in his hand before he turned it face down on the seat beside him. There were calls he could make, names he could ask, information he could gather, the usual process of understanding something he did not immediately control. But this time, the impulse felt different, less urgent, almost unnecessary. Instead, he leaned back, eyes tracing the passing buildings without really seeing them, replaying the moment not as a sequence of actions, but as a question that had not been answered. Not why she refused, but why she did not need to accept. The car turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the main road fading behind them, and Daniel Whitmore, a man who had spent his life defining value in numbers and outcomes, found himself considering something he had never needed to measure before: the cost of not needing anything at all. The car came to a smooth stop in front of Daniel's building, the glass facade reflecting the city lights in perfect symmetry, everything in its place, everything exactly as it should be. And yet he did not move immediately. His driver stepped out, opening the door with practiced timing, but Daniel remained seated for a second longer, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the reflection, as if the answer he was looking for might still be following him through the streets. Finally, he stepped out, adjusting his jacket again, the gesture automatic, controlled, familiar, and walked into the lobby where silence replaced the noise of the night. Polished marble floors, soft lighting, the quiet efficiency of a space designed to impress without effort. The receptionist nodded respectfully, her posture straightening slightly as he passed, but Daniel barely registered it. Inside the elevator, the mirrored walls reflected him from every angle, the tailored suit, the composed expression, the image he had spent years perfecting. And for the first time, it felt incomplete, not because something was missing, but because something had been exposed. The elevator moved upward in smooth silence, each floor passing without interruption, but his thoughts did not follow the same clean progression. Instead, they returned, again and again, to a single moment, a simple sentence delivered without weight, without performance, without any attempt to influence the outcome. When the doors opened, he stepped into his penthouse, the space expansive, quiet, every detail curated, the city stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like something he owned, or at least understood. He set his keys down, loosened his tie slightly, then stopped, his hand resting against the fabric as if reconsidering the motion. Across the room, a glass of water sat untouched on the counter, condensation forming a thin line along its side. A small detail, ordinary, but it reminded him of something. The way she had placed the glass in front of him earlier, precise, deliberate, without seeking acknowledgement. He walked toward it, picked it up, then set it back down without drinking, the action echoing his earlier hesitation in a way that did not feel like coincidence. His phone buzzed once on the table, a message, then another. Notifications stacking in the familiar rhythm of business, decisions waiting, numbers moving, opportunities forming, but he did not reach for it. Instead, he moved to the window, looking out at the city below, the lights stretching endlessly, each one representing a transaction, a decision, a need, a want, a pattern he had mastered. And yet, somewhere in that system, there was a person who had stepped outside of it entirely, who had not rejected his offer in the way others did. but had simply refused to participate in the structure behind it. Daniel exhaled slowly, the reflection of the city shifting across the glass as he leaned slightly closer, his eyes narrowing not in calculation, but in recognition. He had spent years building a world where value could be assigned, measured, negotiated, but tonight had introduced something that did not fit, something that did not respond to leverage, something that remained steady regardless of what was placed in front of it. He turned away from the window, his gaze moving across the room as if seeing it differently, not as a collection of achievements, but as a space filled with things that had always answered him, always adjusted, always complied. And for the first time, that consistency felt less like control and more like limitation. The phone buzzed. Again, louder this time in the silence. But Daniel Whitmore did not move toward it, because for once, the most important question in his mind was not what he could gain next, but what it meant to encounter something that could not be bought at all. The night did not settle the way it usually did. Daniel lay awake longer than expected, the quiet of his penthouse stretching around him, not comforting, not distracting, just present, like a question waiting for an answer he had not yet formed. At some point, the city noise softened into a distant hum, and his thoughts finally slowed, not resolved, just paused. When morning came, it arrived clean and sharp, sunlight cutting through the glass in straight lines across the floor, illuminating everything with the kind of clarity he had always relied on. He moved through his routine with practiced precision, shower, suit, coffee measured to the exact strength he preferred, each step executed without hesitation, but the rhythm felt slightly off, like a song played at the wrong tempo. His phone was already filled with updates, market shifts, meeting reminders, the language of his world returning with full force. And this time he picked it up, scanning quickly, responding where needed, re-establishing control over the parts of his life that always responded. Yet even as he moved through decisions, something remained just beneath the surface, not distracting him, but refusing to disappear. During his first meeting of the day, a discussion about a potential acquisition, he found himself listening more than speaking, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed. His colleagues glanced at him, waiting for the usual decisive input, the clear direction that had built his reputation. But Daniel paused longer than expected, considering not just the numbers, but the assumptions behind them. "We are offering them a strong position," someone said confidently, outlining the benefits, the leverage, the inevitable agreement that would follow. Daniel nodded slightly, but his gaze shifted to the window behind them, the city visible in the distance, and for a brief moment, the words sounded different. Offering, leverage, agreement, the same. Structure, the same pattern, repeated in different forms. "What if they do not want to be in the position we are offering?" he said finally, his tone calm, but carrying a weight that redirected the room. There was a pause, not long, but noticeable, as if the question itself had not been considered before. "They would be irrational to refuse," another voice responded, confident, certain, echoing the logic Daniel had used countless times himself. He leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful, rather than dismissive. "Or they might be operating on a value we are not measuring," he replied, and the silence that followed was not disagreement, but uncertainty. The meeting continued, numbers adjusted, strategies refined, but the shift remained, subtle, almost invisible, yet present in every decision that followed. Later, as the day moved forward, Daniel found himself revisiting small moments. A handshake held a second too long, a response that felt rehearsed, a smile that did not reach. The eyes, details he had always processed quickly but now lingered in his awareness. By late afternoon, the structure of his world had reassembled itself around him. Meetings completed, outcomes secured, everything in motion as it should be. And yet the question remained, unchanged, steady. When he finally stepped back into his car, the same one waiting in the same place at the same time, he did not give a destination immediately. Instead, he looked out through the window, the city moving around him, and for a moment, the decision felt less like a command and more like a choice. "Take me back to the restaurant," he said quietly, not as an impulse, not as curiosity alone, but as something closer to intention. The driver nodded once, adjusting the route without question, and as the car turned into traffic, Daniel Whitmore sat back, his expression composed, his posture unchanged. But the direction he was heading toward now was not part of his routine, and that difference, small as it seemed, carried more weight than any decision he had made that day. The restaurant looked different in daylight, not because anything had changed, but because the illusion had softened. The golden glow was replaced by clean, natural light filtering through tall windows, revealing details that the evening had hidden: the faint scuff on the floor near the entrance, the subtle wear on the edges of the chairs, the quiet honesty of a place that did not rely on shadows to feel important. Daniel stepped inside without hesitation this time, his presence still noticeable, still shifting the attention of those nearby. But he did not pause to acknowledge it. He moved with purpose, not the kind that commanded a room, but the kind that followed a question to its source. Emily was already there, standing behind the counter for a brief moment before the lunch rush, reviewing a small stack of receipts, her posture relaxed, her focus complete, as if the space around her adjusted itself to match her pace rather than the other way around. She looked up as the door closed behind him, not surprised, not curious, just aware. Their eyes met for a second, then she finished aligning the papers in her hand before setting them aside, her movements unchanged, uninterrupted. Daniel approached, slower than he would have the night before, his steps measured, his expression composed, but no longer carrying the same certainty. "You came back," she said simply, not as a question, but as an observation that required no reaction. Daniel nodded once, glancing briefly at the empty tables, the calm before the rhythm of service would begin again. "I wanted to understand something," he replied, his voice steady, but quieter than before, as if the volume itself had adjusted to the space she occupied. Emily stepped out from behind the counter, not closing the distance entirely, just enough to stand across from him without the barrier of the workspace between them. "Most people want to understand outcomes," she said, her tone neutral, not reasons, and there was no challenge in her words, only a reflection of what she had seen too many times. Daniel considered that for a moment, his gaze shifting briefly to the window, then back to her. "I am not most people," he said, the statement familiar, automatic, but lacking the weight it once carried. Emily tilted her head slightly, not disagreeing, not agreeing, simply acknowledging the pattern. "That is what most people say," she replied, and the simplicity of it removed the distinction he had just tried to create. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, not filled with tension, just open, like a space neither of them felt the need to fill immediately. In the background, a staff member adjusted the settings on a table, the quiet sound of silverware aligning against porcelain marking the passing of seconds. Daniel rested his hand lightly on the back of a chair, not claiming it, just grounding himself in the moment. "You said I was offering control," he continued, his tone more reflective now, less defensive. "But you never asked what I would have given instead." And the question lingered, not as a challenge, but as a genuine attempt to reframe something he had always understood one way. Emily looked at him, really looked this time, her expression unchanged, but her attention sharper, more focused. "That is because it was not about what you would give," she said quietly. "It was about what you expected in return." And the clarity of the statement settled between them with a weight that did not need emphasis. Daniel exhaled slowly, the air leaving his chest in a controlled, deliberate motion, as if he was adjusting to a different kind of negotiation, one that did not involve numbers or leverage, but perspective. Outside, the city moved as it always did, cars passing, people walking, the rhythm continuing without pause. But inside, in that small, quiet space between them, something had shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that Daniel Whitmore, a man who had always moved forward with certainty, found himself standing still, not because he had nowhere to go, but because for the first time, he was beginning to see that where he had been going might not have been the only direction that mattered. The lunch hour began to gather around them, subtle at first, a door opening, footsteps crossing the floor, the quiet murmur of voices returning to fill the space. But neither of them moved immediately. Daniel remained where he stood, his hand still resting lightly against the chair, not out of hesitation, but as if certainty that once shaped it. Emily's expression softened, not with sympathy, but with understanding that did not need to be spoken. "You were," she replied, "just not to me." and the simplicity of it removed the last layer of complexity he had been trying to build around the situation. A pause followed, not empty, but complete, as if the conversation had reached a point where nothing needed to be added. Then Emily stepped back fully this time, her attention returning to the room, to the tables now filling, to the rhythm she had never lost. "I have to work," she said gently, not dismissing him, not inviting him to stay, simply stating the reality that had always been there. Daniel nodded once, stepping away from the chair, releasing the space without resistance. He did not reach for his wallet, did not offer anything else, did not try to extend the moment beyond what it was. Instead, he turned toward the door, his steps calm, unhurried, carrying none of the urgency that had defined his arrival the night before. As he reached the entrance, he paused briefly, not to look back, but as if acknowledging something internal, something that had shifted without needing confirmation. Outside, the daylight felt sharper than before, the city louder, more immediate, but his expression remained composed, unchanged on the surface. Inside, Emily continued moving through the room, placing orders, adjusting details, maintaining the same quiet precision she always had, untouched by the presence that had once tried to alter her course. And somewhere between the door closing and the city resuming its rhythm around him, Daniel Whitmore realized that understanding was not always about finding the answer. Sometimes it was about recognizing that not everything required one. Daniel did not return that evening, or the next, or the week after, and that absence was not avoidance, not retreat, but something quieter, something more deliberate. He moved through his days with the same precision, the same structure, the same expectations placed on him by a world that had always responded, but there was a subtle difference now, a pause before certain decisions, a moment where he considered not just what he could offer, but what was being assumed in return. Meetings continued, deals closed, numbers aligned, yet occasionally, in the middle of a conversation, he would stop just long enough to listen past the words, to notice the hesitation in someone's voice, the way a response formed too quickly, the difference between agreement and acceptance. It did not change the outcome every time, but it changed how he saw it, and that shift, small as it seemed, began to settle into something consistent. One afternoon, weeks later, he found himself walking down the same street again, not because he had planned it, not because he needed to be there, but because his steps had taken him in that direction without resistance. The restaurant stood as it always had, unchanged, steady, the glass reflecting the city in fragments that reassembled as you moved. Inside, the rhythm continued, tables filled, conversations layered over one another, the quiet choreography of service unfolding. Without interruption, Emily was there, moving through it all with the same calm precision, placing a cup of coffee in front of a customer before they asked, adjusting a chair slightly to create space, her attention fully present in each moment without ever appearing rushed. Daniel did not approach her immediately this time. He did not interrupt the flow she maintained so naturally. Instead, he took a seat at a table near the window, not the one he had chosen before, just a simple place that did not demand attention. When she eventually reached him, her expression remained the same, composed, neutral, aware. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice steady, offering nothing more, nothing less. Daniel nodded, returning the greeting without adding to it. And for a brief second, there was no weight between them, no expectation, no unfinished conversation pressing forward. He ordered simply, nothing elaborate, nothing designed to test or observe, just a meal. As she turned to leave, he spoke. Again, not to continue the past, but to acknowledge the present. "You were right," he said, and the words were not framed as defeat, not offered as concession, just stated as fact. Emily paused, not fully turning back, just enough to hear him clearly. "About what?" she asked, her tone unchanged. Daniel looked at the table for a moment, then back at her, his expression steady, grounded in something that no longer needed to prove itself. "Not everything needs to fit," he replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything he could have explained. Emily studied him briefly, not searching, not evaluating, just recognizing the difference, the absence of something that had once defined him. She gave a small nod, not approval, not validation, just acknowledgement, and continued on with her work. The moment passed without ceremony, without resolution, blending into the rhythm of the room as if it had always belonged there. Daniel sat back, his gaze drifting toward the window, the city moving beyond it in the same endless pattern, but this time, it did not feel like something he needed to control or understand completely. His meal arrived, placed in front of him with the same quiet precision as before, and for once, he simply accepted it as it was, without measuring, without adjusting, without needing it to be anything more. And somewhere in that quiet acceptance, something settled, not as an answer, but as a realization that did not require one. That sometimes, the value of a moment was not in what it changed, but in what it revealed, and that respect, the kind that could not be offered or taken, only recognized, had never been something he could place a price on, no matter how certain he once believed he could.